Oh, didn't know. Okay. Hey, my name is Kenny Johnson. I am in the products team here with Jason. One of my learning goals for this week was to understand multi-project pipelines. I had slacked Jason and asked him if he would join for this discussion to help walk me through it as an expert. One thing I'll share, I told Jason, like, I'm not even looking to understand how I would implement them. I'm really looking to understand how they're used and kind of what's going on with the pipelines. Jason, I had a specific example that brought me to this. It was from the discussion around how to, I think Tim Poffenberger had proposed a solution for how to include specific pipelines into other pipelines, but we don't have to use that one. It seems pretty complicated. If you have like an example that would showcase them, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I'll think about it. I'll start with kind of like the big picture and how the feature evolved and where it is today. It did start out as a way to trigger pipelines between multi-projects. So you could have, a classic microservices example where you've got everything in its own project is a good example where, yeah, maybe you've got a couple backend services, maybe you've got a front-end service, maybe you've got like a mobile app. And so you want these things to be able to trigger each other as the dependencies between them are kind of resolved. So if you update the backend, then maybe you should update your web. And you can use multi-project pipelines to trigger these relationships. That feature's been around for a while, possibly even before I joined, which was a couple of years ago. We've made some nice improvements to it where like it can all show up on one nice view now. So if you ever click on a downstream pipeline at the end of the view, it'll jump you over to the new one, kind of shift everything. And so we try to make it look a little bit connected. In the future, we actually plan to make it look like really just a single view and have them connected to each other, but we haven't quite figured out the UX for that.
In that example, just it's a totally separate pipeline with its own set of jobs. It's just the fact that another pipeline definition for the triggered one might get triggered by a merge request or a commit or a tag. In this case, it's getting triggered by the fact that another pipeline ended successfully. That's really
well, not even necessarily ended successfully. So the way that it's implemented on the back end is there's something called a bridge job, which is a job from our kind of like internal modeling standpoint that's connected to another running entire pipeline. So you can almost look at it as like a kind of fractal, like you're going down into the pipeline rather than you're attaching things at either end.
Okay.
And that's actually, so that bridge job is what we've been working on lately and improving in order to add things like child-parent pipelines, which work the same way. So the child-parent pipeline, instead of triggering a pipeline in a different project, just triggers one in its own project on a GitLab CI YAML in a different folder, but then uses a bridge job to connect that pipeline status back to the parent. And then the other feature, I think the one that sounded like Tim was talking about, is one where you can dynamically generate the YAML in your pipeline and then start a bridge job to run a pipeline based on that dynamic YAML you just generated. So you have basically at that point total flexibility. And that's kind of an overview of that feature today.
On that, the bridge job thing is making me wonder, is like, before we had this feature, would a way of accomplishing the same thing be that you actually defined a job and had that job call an API that said go trigger a pipeline over here?
Yeah, people would curl our API from a script section of a job and it would go trigger the pipeline, and then they would just sit there polling the API using curl to wait for it.
And so is there anything else in that bridge job that's transferred? Like, can I transfer artifacts or other content to the new jobs or variables?
Not quite yet, although I don't think it's out yet. It may be out this month to be able to pass artifacts. It doesn't yet. You can, of course, because that pipeline has an ID and you can go, request the ID of that pipeline and then go get it, but you sort of have to do it yourself. It isn't built in where you say like, give me, there's no way to say basically, give me the artifacts for this pipeline and for any children that it happened to create. There's no like single way to do that. You'd have to go, okay, give me this pipeline and then look at it and say, okay, it looks like it started these child pipelines. So let me go now make another call to access, those, and then you can sort of assemble it back on your end, but that's the way it works.
Okay, I think I understand how it works. Would you mind going through an example that would like showcase? The canonical example you gave was the microservices one, and maybe there's a different one that is a better use case. I guess I would just kind of want to walk through why I would use it in the first place. So we can use that
Yeah.
microservices one as an example. I
The
would set up.
microservices is one example. Is there part of that one that was still unclear?
Yeah, I guess the why I would want to trigger a front end rebuild on a
Right.
back end rebuild.
It would be based on the dependencies between those things. So if there's code in the front end that needs to take advantage of a change you made in the back end, then those relationships would be there. And so, yeah, like if you added a new endpoint to your app that returns a new cool kind of graph that you want to show on your front end, then you would then need to rebuild and redeploy the front end in order to pick up those changes.
Yeah, and so maybe let me think of a different example that I've known from my past. Let's say I have a project. I have like I guess I would think of it as like the testing example where I want to test that my new code not only works in my local environment but also works when tested against some dependency. That's not a use case for multi-project pipeline. You wouldn't say, oh, go run and make sure you have the latest version of this other project, and then run their pipeline, and then run the rest of my pipeline?
You could. You could really kind of, yeah. I mean, it kind of, I guess it depends on how you would it will really come down to your stack and how it's implemented.
Okay.
But if you're publishing to like a central package repository or something like that, the way that I described it is simpler. If you're doing something like C header files and you need to like actually get the source of the first thing, and then you kind of compile it all together into one object, then yeah, maybe like you need to actually do some of your own steps and then call a child pipeline of something else, wait for it to finish, and then resume doing some of your own steps. And that's certainly possible too. The way that we see that use case more frequently is when we get into the child pipelines and people are dynamically generating the thing to be run.
Okay.
So if you think about like building software for hardware, you might have a bunch of different targets. You'd have debug and release at least, and then maybe you would have a couple more. And then on the other axis of your matrix, you would have like ARM and x86 and whatever other like architectures you're going after. And you may not want to just make jobs for all of those things because it may vary based on what changed or even what environments you have available. So at runtime, you could go out and kind of say like, okay, what am I dealing with here? What changes were in the pipeline? What environments are available to me? And then dynamically generate some YAML and call a child pipeline to handle all of that.
Okay.
And then monorepo is the other one where if you want to have, so GitLab is a great example where we have just like this massive GitLab CI YAML that has everything built in one single place. So you can also use child parent pipelines to break that out into individual pieces to be handled separately so that you can avoid a lot of that complexity.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the microservices multi-project example, let's say I had 3 different microservices. I would think of that as I would want to have the multi-project pipeline for the deploy process. And maybe what I'm having a hard time with is the distinction between when I would use it for like more of CI versus CD. And is the microservices an example one that you would use it for both CI and CD?
You could. It would depend on how kind of centralized it would map to your organizational structure, I would think, probably. So like if you have a build and release centralized team that builds the build scripts and builds the deploy scripts and sort of oversees the whole thing, then it's very likely that you would have one master pipeline that's like the release pipeline, maybe you would call it. And it goes out and kicks off all of the builds and then waits for them to finish and then kicks off all of the tests and then kicks off all of the deploys. Like once it's kind of orchestrating the whole thing. If you have individual software development teams that are building microservices that are able to deliver on their own, then really you just want to say, well, I know my microservice is dependent on this team. And so I just know that whenever they do an update, I want to go pick it up and redeploy my stuff as well. And so you can use it in both ways.
Okay, sorry, and that helps me. You're not talking about running these multi-project pipelines in the middle of what you would consider your like inner testing loop. This is more, oh, that pipeline completed and now I need to go update something, not in order to complete my inner testing loop, but in order to be aware and have available
Yeah, it's
the new
more like
update from
project
another.
level pipeline.
Okay.
Pipelines are more at the project level. Of course you could. I mean, you could, if you conceived of some situation where you had like a very, very complicated testing process that was owned by another team, maybe some kind of lab testing process then it would kick off some lab process or something like that. And that could be very tightly within your own little project. It's something that kicks off a child pipeline, but that would be relatively rare, I think.
Okay. Okay, that helps. So that you would want to bubble that this is primarily useful at that, yeah, the way you described it is great, like project level use case.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly you can use the functionality for lots of different ones, but it would be not for, I need to call this maybe like the original trigger isn't necessarily commit, it might be more, or a merge request, it might be more like a tag or a release, then we do some coordinated activity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could, in most cases, I think they would all be kind of a complete pipeline of their own, each child. It's a way to namespace things as well. You could think of it that way.
Okay, cool, super helpful. So I love the like origin story of how this could have been done, and then that we're making it easier, and there's a future plan to improve the UX. And then now I think I have a much better understanding of the use case.
Yeah, it's a pretty great feature, and the big improvements for it are just making it seamless, making it feel seamless inside the application, because you can, right now you can bump up against those places where it's like, okay, now I'm shifting mode into a child pipeline, now I'm shifting back. Getting artifacts is one of them, visually, going to a new pipeline page. They're little things that aren't artifacts of the architecture that we have, but are artifacts of the path that we took to get here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it makes sense.
But those things are being prioritized.
The user of that multi-project pipeline considers the whole thing one experience, but
I think
multi-project.
Yeah, it's nicer to think of things that way.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thank you, Kenny.